Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Ollie. Welcome to the third tutorial in this series of Java for beginners. So in this tutorial we're going to be going over variables. Now the easiest way to think of a variable is using the matchbox analogy, and using my awesome paint drawing skills I'm going to show you this analogy now. So what we're meant to have here is two matchboxes. We have one with a label saying name and one with a label saying age. Now this matchbox represents a variable. So what happens when we slide out the matchbox like so? We can see in the name we have the value of Ollie, and in the age we have the value of 17. And the point behind this analogy is to show that the label of the variable can be just a generic thing such as name or age, but the value of the variable, what's inside the matchbox, can be anything you want. So that's basically the easiest way to think of a variable at this beginner stage. So hopefully that was quite a good analogy. I thought it was when I was learning Java for the first time. But now I'm going to put that analogy into practice, and I'm going to show you how we do it. So this is basically the exact same setup we had from the last tutorial, minus the hello world statement. So what I'm going to do is make some space there, and I'm going to show you how we declare variables. So I'll first teach you about something called comments. And what comments do is they're basically lines of code, but they're not really code. They're just sort of notes to yourself and other people reading your code, and they're ignored by the compiler, so you won't get errors for typing these notes. So the way we do comments in Java is by simply doing 2 forward slashes like so, and we can write a comment here. And when we hit run, this line here is going to be completely ignored because the 2 forward slashes indicate we're writing a comment, so the compiler just ignores that and skips to the next line. And it's basically an easy way to leave ourselves notes in case if it's a complicated bit of code, if we might want to remind ourselves what something does. There are loads of different uses for comments. In the case of these tutorials, I'm going to be using them to help clarify different things I'm teaching you. So without further ado, I'll show you how we can make variables. So the first thing for a variable we need to write is the variable type. And much like we did with the keyword class and then we gave it a name, we need to specify the type of variable, which is usually a built-in Java keyword, and then we give it a name. However, it's not called a name, it's called an identifier. Sorry, I can't type and speak at the same time. There we go. So we first declare the variable type, and we then declare an identifier. And the identifier is basically the name by which we will be referencing the variable. And you'll see what I mean by that later on. So once we've done the variable type and identifier, we can just put a semicolon and end the line there, because that's all that's technically required. An optional step for declaring our variables is to give it a value. So we can write the assignment operator, which is basically a fancy word for the equals, and then we can give it an appropriate value. So now let's put all of this into practice. What I'm going to do is declare a variable. So first, the variable type. The most basic type of variables in Java are number variables, and these come in many different forms. I think there's about 6 or 7 different types of built-in Java numbers. The easiest one to think of is an integer, and an integer is basically a whole number. It doesn't have any decimal points, and if you try and give it any decimal points, it will either remove them or it will give you an error. So the way we declare an integer variable in Java is we write the word int, and you can see it highlights in blue because that's a built-in Java keyword. So that's our variable type right there, integer. So what's the next step? We need to give it an identifier. So we need to give it a name in which to reference it. Now I'm going to just call it A. Probably bad programming practice to call it something like A because we don't really know what we're doing with it, but for the sake of these beginner tutorials, I'm just going to call the variable A. So like I said earlier, this is done now. We can put our semicolon and end that there, and you can now see we've successfully declared an integer variable called A, and that's going to sit there happily until we decide to do something with it. So this optional step is to give it a value. So what we do to give it a value is first give the assignment operator, which is basically the equal sign, and then we can give it any integer value. So an integer is a whole number, so it needs to be a whole number that we give it. We can just write, say, the number 25. And it's as simple as that. So let me explain more in depth what the assignment operator does. What the assignment operator does, it assigns the value on the right hand side to the value on the left hand side. So whenever you use this equal sign, it's going to put the value on the right into the value on the left. The only limitation to this is that the value on the left must always be a variable, because obviously you can't assign 25 a value, because 25 will always equal 25, except the value on the right hand side doesn't have to be a specific number. It can be just another variable, so you assign the value of one variable to another variable, like so. But that is basically it for teaching you about variables here. I'm going to now print out this variable using system.out.println, and I'm just going to put a here. I'm going to put the name of the identifier in this system.out.println, and what that's going to do is it's going to run this code here. It's going to say, right, we need an integer variable called a, so it's going to set aside some memory, and then it's going to store the number 25 in that memory, and that is basically going to sit there. It doesn't output it or anything, it just sits there ready for our use. So now when we come down to system.out.println, we give the parameter a, which is this variable here. So it's Java's thinking, right, what's a? We better find what a is. So it goes back to the memory location it stored it in, and it's going to retrieve the value of 25. So this isn't going to print out the letter a, it's going to print out the value of 25. And we'll just hit OK on that. So you can see, if I drag this up, it prints out the number 25, and that's because, like I said, it stores the number 25 in the variable a, and then we print out the value of variable a. So what if you need something other than an integer? Well, for the rest of this tutorial, I'm simply going to explain the different types of number variables we have in Java, and once we've done that, we're ready for the next tutorial, which is all about mathematical operations in Java. So what we can do is, I'm going to just show you the various other types of the various other variable types, and then I'm also going to show you different ways we can assign variables in Java. So an identical way of doing this would be to remove this step here, this equals 25, and then if we ever want to reference a later on, because we've already created it, we don't need to write int a, because the keyword int means we want to declare a variable, but it's already been declared up here. So we can just simply write a, because we've already made it. We can then just set it equal to 25. And these two lines of code here do exactly the same thing as the previous one, except they just do it in a slightly longer way. So now that I've told you that slight variation, I'm gonna just digress a bit and go tell you about the different number variable types and the amount of storage they take up. So this may not be entirely relevant to learning Java, but it's still good. So let me just remove that because a doesn't exist anymore. So the first variable type we have, or I'll go up in order of size actually. So the first variable type, the smallest variable type we have, is a byte. And you can see it highlights in blue because it's a keyword, and you probably already know what a byte is. A byte is simply 8 bits, and it can store a value of up to 255. So if I call this byte b, and I won't set it equal to anything, I'll just add a comment saying how many bits it takes up. So a byte takes up 8 bits of memory. We then have a short variable, I'll name it s, and this variable is larger than a byte. It can hold values up to around 32,000, I believe, and this is 16 bits large. And all variables in Java are signed, and what signed means, it means the value can be negative or positive. If you've ever worked with a language such as C or C++, you'll know that the variables can be unsigned as well, which means you can't go negative, but in Java we can't really control that. All variables are signed, so they can be positive or negative. So short variables can hold up to 16 bits of information. We then have our integer variables, which I'll name I. This holds 32 bits, which goes up to some stupidly large number. We then have the long variable, and we'll call this L. This takes up 64 bits, and this can store some extremely large numbers. There's not, I wouldn't say rare, but you won't really need to use long very much, especially if you're trying to conserve memory. So those are all of the integer variable types. Sorry if I've missed any. Now I'll go on to the decimal types. So there's two different types of decimal numbers. Well, first one is float. I'll call that f. And this float variable is 32 bits. Excuse me. And then we have a double variable, and call this d. And this takes up 64 bits. There we go. So the difference between this set here and this set here is that these are all integer variables, they can only store whole numbers, and these two here are decimal numbers, so we can set this equal to 3.14. As you can see, it has a decimal value point. You can also set it equal to an integer, but if you know it's always going to be an integer, then you might as well avoid confusion and use one of these ones instead. So you can see we can set this equal to that, and then we can also set the float equal to the same thing, except the difference between these two is that float is smaller than this. And the reason that this is underlined red is because this is still counted as a double number. It's not technically a float. The way we differentiate between different types of variables is simply by adding the prefix of the variable type. So to tell Java, we need to reassure Java that we're using a float rather than double. All we need to do is put the letter F, and then for the other ones we can put the letter D. It's not necessary, it's just to it's only really necessary if Java is throwing an error like it was for this float one here, but we can just reassure Java by putting the prefix of the variable type in front of it. And we can say set long equal to 1,000,000, and we can just put the letter L there to just to make sure it's a long variable. We can also do it with an integer, although it's not that necessary. Or we can't do it with an integer, sorry, because whenever we write an integer number, it's always implied as an integer, so we don't need to do it for that. And the same thing applies for the short and the byte. So hopefully all of that made sense. In the next tutorial, we're going to be going over strings and mathematical operators. In this tutorial, we went over variable types, identifiers, assignment operators, and how to give values to your variables. So if anything didn't make sense, watch the tutorial again. Hopefully you learned from this, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.